Techland's Dying Light 2 is here after several huge delays, and its additional time in the oven to bake shines through in the final product. Gorgeous visuals, a genre-defining open world, fantastic character models and animations, unique gameplay, and very few technical issues. The end product is a development marvel. However, the same cannot be said for its laborious, mundane plot that only lumbers ever greater the longer the game goes on. While the decisions you are forced to make as a character seem consequential and interesting at first, their limitations are ultimately revealed through their execution. Dying Light 2, for better and for worse, shows the upper limit of what is possible in an open world, and the reveal can oftentimes be disappointing. The game focuses around Aiden Caldwell, played by voice actor Jonas Scott, doing his absolute best Troy Baker impression. Seriously, you could not pay me enough money to convince me this isn't Baker.
Someone offering to help. I'll check what happened to the power.
Aiden is a pilgrim, someone that runs errands between the isolated territories that litter the game's zombie-infested world. As a child, Aiden and his sister Mia were part of experiments evil scientists were conducting with the virus that created the undead. The pair have been separated for years, and Aiden's quest to find Mia again has brought him to Villador, a city on the verge of rebuilding if only its warring factions could get along. It's an incredibly by-the-numbers story that feels numbingly familiar, and the devs of the game attempt to spice things up by having you make key decisions that affect the outcome of the game, aligning with the two different factions, the Peacekeepers or the Survivors. The former are essentially the new fascist police force that rule via an iron fist, and the latter is essentially everyone else, trying to live via more harmonious means. There's also a third faction, the Renegades, who come into conflict with both parties. At first, the decisions the game has you choose between seem incredibly vital, and a few certainly do have massive consequences when it comes to how the story progresses. But while at first they feel like a huge advancement for choose-your-own-adventure storytelling, they only highlight how limited they actually are, and the mirage quickly begins to crumble. For example, in the early moments of the game, you're asked to help one of either of the factions. I made my decision, but very soon after, new information came to light regarding my new allies, and I began to have doubts about my choice. I was expecting another new option to come up, allowing me to either alter my alignment or potentially offer a new third option. No such decision was ever available, with Aiden continuing along his determined path, much to my dismay. Another frustrating aspect are the consequences, which in some situations there are none. In a situation later in the game, Aiden was assisted by members of one of the factions to secure a strategic location, with the understanding that he would turn over control of that location to that faction when the time came. I didn't, instead handing it over to the opposition, and when I stepped out expecting retaliation for my decision, I was met with none. To further expose the issues with decision-making in the game, aligning with the different factions offers changes in the world itself. For example, the Peacekeepers will place car traps for your enemies around the city, whereas the Survivors will attach more zip lines between buildings for traversal. You can see the entire lineup of alterations for both factions from the jump, which means that ultimately, my decisions were based on which upgrades I wanted, rather than any thematic or character-based incentives. It doesn't help that the game is just bloated, not necessarily with side quests and other distractions in the periphery, but within the main story itself. It takes nearly 15 hours to play the opening of the game in Old Villador, before even accessing the city itself, and that's with actually trying to get through it as quickly as possible. This is thanks to completely unnecessary endless fetch quests that become laughable as to how many steps they involve. Too often you're tasked with speaking to a certain character who then needs you to speak to someone else, and then they need you to find something for them, but you need to find something else in order to get that thing. The number of times I burst into laughter because I was tasked with yet another step in a mission chain was a joke in and of itself. It's not even like the original story of you looking for your sister is even that interesting, as it's the plot of an incalculable amount of media revolving around apocalypses. But it becomes frustrating how much it eventually just gives way to the conflict between the factions at large. The game even comes to a literal roadblock at one point, and simply asks you to do tasks for the different groups for a bit. Techland came under a ton of backlash for promoting that the game would take 500 hours to 100%, and its main plot is a prime example of why longer isn't always, if rarely, better. What surprised me about the bloat is how it didn't pertain to the gameplay and design. Unlike an Ubisoft game such as Far Cry, I didn't feel like I was drowning in markers on a map, with outposts to take down and watchtowers to claim. Don't get me wrong, both of those things still exist in the game, but they feel much more naturally implemented, things to do along the way rather than things to check off a list. Another aspect that this game excels in, that I've been wanting from Far Cry 4 forever, is the exploration and verticality of the world. The game seamlessly weaves a lot of its interiors with its exteriors, as you parkour along a rooftop, through a window in some rooms, and back out into the open. The scalability of the city, once you eventually reach it, is technically astounding, and the puzzle on how to navigate up and around its skyscrapers feels both accessible and satisfying. I also liked the new addition of Infection, which kicks in shadow and during the nighttime, forcing the player to find a source of UV light, adding an extra layer of intensity to the gameplay. It's clear a lot of attention went into the game's parkour mechanics and refining them as best they could. While there are the occasional missteps when you don't make a jump the way you expected, you more often than not are easily able to get into a groove that feels unlike anything else you've ever played. The same can be said for the first-person, melee-focused action that shows how to get that right. You eventually unlock some ranged options, but they pale in comparison to the close-quarter combat weapons, which can be tricked out with delightful modifications. Speaking of which, it's amazing how refined the different gameplay systems feel in light of how unrefined the game's story is. I never felt overwhelmed by crafting or modding options, and the ability to adjust Aiden's inventory as well as upgrading his abilities feels fast and intuitive, getting you out of the menus quicker and back to the action. The game is also stunning. I have been playing on a PC, and the developers only unlocked keys for PlayStation 4 and Xbox One consoles 2 days before embargo, so time will tell how well it runs on the previous generation of hardware. But on the current gen, the game is a visual feast. The character models, particularly when under UV lights, are remarkable, and the animations for enemies give a sense of weight when in combat. When talking about performance, it's an S-tier game. Dying Light 2 impresses in numerous ways, but that unfortunately just exacerbates its least impressive parts. It could be one thing if the game was releasing in a window, like its predecessor, when the video game release calendar was devoid of any other hits, but this is perhaps one of the busiest months ever for gaming, with Pokemon releasing only the week prior, and other massive open world titles like Horizon Forbidden West and Elden Ring not far off. If the last few years could have been spent stripping the game down to its strongest elements and kept its story lean and mean, Dying Light 2 could have been a game that people were talking about as a possible contender for Game of the Year. But its onerous components reduce the impact of its strengths considerably.